Hello, I'm Adelina, and I'm glad you're here for another episode of Life with God. Today we continue our conversation on God and freedom with our guest Cory Wetterlin, Associate Professor of Religion and Chair of the Humanities Department at Kettering College in Kettering, Ohio. Before we explore today's themes, let's take a moment to get to know our guest. What is a favorite vacation memory?
The first one that came to mind was going to Alaska with my dad. We did a lot of fishing up there, so fly fishing. There was one particular afternoon that was a lot of fun, just walking up and down the bank and throwing in it's called a dry fly when you're fly fishing, so it floats on the surface and you watch the fish come up and grab it when you're fishing. So that's one that comes to mind first.
Yeah, name one thing that is very valuable to you.
Authenticity was very valuable to me.
What achievement are you most proud of?
Almost 23 years of marriage.
What's an interesting thing you have learned from another culture?
How to better care for other people.
How would you title your own biography? Or what keywords would be in the title, maybe?
Yeah. Asking questions. So questions, searching, and emotional mental health, I think probably would be involved.
What do you love most about God?
The promise or possibility of his presence.
Who is your favorite historical person besides Jesus?
This should be easy, right? Speed round. I don't know. Yeah, I'm just blanking right now. So there's lots of people I've learned from. My daughter always asks me these questions, like, what was your favorite part of the movie? Who's your favorite character? I'm like, all of it.
Holistic thinking, I guess.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
So, most important item on your bucket list?
It really comes back to just like life and journey and process, and so it's loving my family well, I think, is which is kind of big and vague, but it's also moment by moment. So
how did you overcome one of your fears?
The first one that I don't know that I don't have it as much as anymore, so maybe this overcame it. But the first one that comes to mind is when I was a kid, my folks lived up on the side of a hill and we had a barn, and I used to get scared of the dark. And walking back from the barn to the house, I don't know exactly how I overcame it. I remember running back to the house multiple times when I was a kid, and then at one point I didn't have to run anymore, so got used to it, I guess. I don't know.
Is there a research topic that you always come back to, and what is it?
Yeah, the research topic I keep coming back to is divine presence and dwelling of the Spirit, and what that means and how can we connect to God.
What moment in history would you like to visit in time travel, and why?
My daughter loves to go to Renaissance fairs. And so it's like, oh, well, that could be kind of fun, except for when you look at history itself, you're like, I don't think I would ever want to live in that time period. But maybe if it was just for a visit, sure.
One of your biggest regrets?
You're going to hear a reoccurring theme. Biggest regrets is not being present myself in life and with people around me, getting distracted by other things or becoming unavailable to others. That's the regret that hangs with me.
Thanks so much for sharing, Cory, and thank you for coming back to Life with God.
Yeah.
Today we have a conversation about freedom, and we will begin with just a brief question for our participants. And then we'll go into the discussion on freedom in theology from a philosophical and theological perspective as well. Okay. So here's a question for the participants. Can you share a moment when you felt free?
Well, there was a time when I went to Bolivia to study, and I started learning Spanish, and I had the opportunity to start researching and opening up new websites and books. And that was interesting because I felt like a huge barrier was between me and the world, and that language barrier was down. So I could reach even more. And I remember I went to Wikipedia to see the amount of articles in Spanish. And then I see that there were a double number than Portuguese. And then I said, wow, look at so much knowledge I have access. So that was a moment of freedom I felt.
For me, it was kind of recently, and it's a bit personal, but my moment of freedom was through empathy. I had 2 previous ex-boyfriends, and I was the one who broke up. And I had a situation where the guy I was with, he broke up with me, and I understood like all the behavior and questions that came up to the minds of my exes when I broke up. And I was like, whoa, okay, now that makes sense. And there's a lot of guilt that was like relieved from me, because I always felt very guilty of like being the one who broke up. But having that happen to me, it was weird, but it like was one of the best things that happened to me, having someone to break up with me. But through that empathy, I felt extremely free. So that was amazing for me.
For me, it takes me back to my childhood, where I grew up in a Adventist home. My father's a pastor, and growing up as a son, we have some standards that our parents keep for us, and especially when I'm the youngest of a family, so I have an older brother, and I always had this notion that I had to live up to a standard that my father kept. And there used to be an element of fear where I would disappoint him. But there came a point where I came to an age where my father said, no, you can do what you want to do. You can do what you love to do. And then I felt the notion of fear just vanished away. And then I felt that's freedom right there. I didn't have to live up to someone's standard, but then this is something that I can do for myself, and it's my choice. And I just felt, wow. So the element of fear kind of was removed from the picture, and then that's where I think I experienced true freedom.
Thank you so much for sharing. It's interesting because you each shared a kind of a different aspect of freedom, and that just made me realize that freedom is so ingrained into our being that almost everything is related to it. Choices, responsibility, being able to access to knowledge, opening of horizons, that's freedom of responsibility, so it's like we can come to this topic from so many different angles, both experientially and theoretically, I think. We'll try to do a little bit more of both in this conversation, looking also at some theories, but as well also, as Cory mentioned, holistically at some of the practical implications of that for daily life, especially maybe for Christian daily life, because that is our focus. So let's go into an in-depth discussion on freedom. And start with Cory, if you could share with us broadly at the moment. We'll go in depth later, I hope. But if you could share with us kind of the spectrum of views on freedom of choice in Christianity.
Yeah,
Paint us the big picture.
sure. Yeah. So I think about this along the lines of ways that we've seen it done recently in several different things that have been written, right? John Peckham did this example with Doctrine of Love. I used a similar example for presence, and that is looking at kind of a spectrum of the God-world relationship. So if we were to go all the way on one side, we have an understanding that separates God from the world completely, right? In a classical theological way, that God is outside of time and space, and is therefore above and beyond all of those kinds of concepts, which means that in a God who's outside of time and space, perfection is unchanging, right? He cannot change, he will not change, because if he changed, either he wasn't perfect before or he isn't perfect now. And what that means for freedom of choice, right, is that God would by nature know everything that's going to happen. And sometimes theologians say this is by decree. God set up decrees of the way life is going to go, the way salvation is going to run for each person. And therefore, there is no real choice for human individuals because it's already been decreed by God. And to a certain extent, some have argued that there's no real freedom of choice for God here either, because by his nature, by who he is, these decrees have flowed out of who he is. Therefore, there's no real free choice for God either, simply because it's going to happen. There are those, I'll swing all the way over here to the other side because the reaction is the kind of the strongest to see, and then we can find some middle ground. So all the way from this classical view, we come over to this other side, which we talk about in terms of like open theism, or which means the future is still open, it hasn't been determined, God is still interactive in some way in which the future will be produced. And one of the kind of extreme views of this is what's called process theology or process philosophy, which suggests that God is in process in the same way the world is, in the same way every person is. We react to things as they come along. Now, God has a better idea of what that means, his knowledge, because he knows the past perfectly, he knows the present perfectly, but the future is still unknown. So God interacts with things in process. And what that means for freedom and freedom of choice is that, one, the divine God is completely open as far as free will and freedom of choice. He's interacting with things as they happen, but it's also liberated free will for humans as well, because they have complete freedom to choose and do whatever they want to. And then God responds along with humanity as they make these choices. So in between liberated free will and freedom of choice and prescribed or determined, right, choice is all this spectrum in the middle. And we try and figure out what that looks like. And some will say, well, God can make decrees on the big things, and we can make choices about small things. We have the freedom to choose on micro levels, right? You can choose what kind of shirt you're going to put on today. But when it comes to your salvation, that's already predetermined. We to more of a space where we say, well, humanity, God has limited himself, self-limited him, put restrictions on himself in order to create a love relationship, meaning we can choose to respond to him or not. And sometimes evil comes out of that, sometimes goodness comes out of that. So it's a spectrum anywhere in between controlled choice and no choice to complete freedom of choice.
I have a question. It comes to my mind that not always the word freedom means something good. It can also mean something negative. And so does the lack of freedom. I think deep within me, I think that when there is moments when the lack of freedom, it's helpful. Do you agree with that idea? How do you see that?
Yeah, there. Some of that's in definition of terms, right? Would we call extravagance or indulgence, maybe is the word, right? Would we call indulgence freedom or not, right? Is freedom good? Is freedom bad? I created as I was getting ready to come and be a part of this recording, I was kind of creating a list of different things that feel like what could be defined as captivity versus what could be defined as freedom. And so we might say something like addiction is captivity and sobriety is freedom, but it would seem like addiction is freedom, right? You can do whatever you want. You can be addicted to whatever you want. You can choose to do whatever you want. But then that freedom turns into a captivity where a more sober life, something that follows particular standards and pattern of behavior, actually frees up a lot of the rest of your life. So yeah, I would say sometimes we could say unbounded freedom could be a negative thing, whereas living within boundaries can be a positive thing.
I have a question that's kind of how can I explain? Some people have this idea that yeah, everybody's free, and just like in religion or in like normal life, freedom, when you do something, there are consequences to it. But when it comes to God and we have this freedom, the consequences, they are way like let's put it like extreme, like death, like I forgot the word in English, but anyway, so how can I try to give that perception to people that the freedom that comes with God, it's different than the freedom that the world offers. Like, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And if they are extreme, like what can we talk about it then?
If they are extreme, is that what you said?
I mean the consequences, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, one of the ways I guess to think about it is that when we think about freedom of choice, and this often comes in when we talk about the question of suffering, right? Like, why is there suffering? Why is there evil in the world? Why do I have to go through the things that I have to go through? And one of the areas in which we talk about suffering is in the area of like moral choice or moral freedom. And so God extends moral choice and moral freedom to us to be able to choose whether we want to follow what he thinks is good for us or not, right? And that is often where we end up getting caught up in suffering, because we choose to do something that's harmful to ourselves, or we choose to do something that's harmful to someone else. So God gives us complete freedom to do whatever we want. And yet there's this space where he says, if you would surrender or consecrate your life to following the kind of boundaries of love that I have in mind for you, right, you really will feel more free. There's one of my favorite kind of popular theology authors, his name is John Eldredge. He wrote this book, and which he titled The Utter Relief of Holiness. To not have to be caught up in all this stuff we're wrestling with back and forth is a relief, right? And so actually holiness and living within the boundaries of love that God offers brings a relief, brings a peace. I would say a simple example is even just healthful living choices, which I'm trying to wrestle with right now. I'm really good at focusing on emotional health. I'm not so good at focusing on physical health. For whatever reason, that's just the way I'm wired. So I'm trying to get back within those boundaries of physical health. And I could eat whatever I wanted. I could do whatever I wanted physical activity wise, but then I find that I feel bound to this physical body that I'm in, where I can't bend over and tie my shoes without losing breath, right? Like, it's not helpful. It's not really free for me. So yeah, living within those boundaries can offer us true freedom in doing the things that we really want to be able to do, the things that are valuable.
This is quite interesting to me, because I think what transpired so far in the conversation, especially with the last two questions, which I think are quite connected, is, I don't know how to put it any better, but it sounds like the freedom we have, how we use whatever freedom we have at any moment, will either lead us into more freedom or bondage. So it's almost like self-perpetuating. You can't make a choice and have no consequences, and the consequences seem to be either towards freedom or towards bondage. That's the nature of freedom itself. Because earlier, with the example you gave earlier, the freedom to choose leads you towards further freedom or not. So it's like we can't really escape this way of being, right?
Yeah, it seems to be wrapped up within the nature of relationships and who we are, right? Sometimes we think about it in the sense of, oh, if I choose to do this thing that's illegal, I'll get imprisoned. Yeah, true. But really, all of that is wrapped up within a relational context of, if I choose to interact with the people around me in a particular way, it will lead towards more freedom, or it will lead to captivity in the sense of like abandonment, right? Abandonment or rejection is a form of captivity. And it comes out of, sometimes, not always, out of our choices, which alienate others towards us. So even within relationships, legally, relationships, health-wise, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? The things that we choose move us towards greater freedom, or they move us towards being bound in some way.
Quick follow-up, and then I know that Andrew has a question too, and I'd love to hear it in a moment. So, because I want to push here a bit more. So then I don't expect you to have a full answer to this, Cory, because it's a very complex topic, of course, but
Sure.
I'm just wrestling with these questions now. So then how do you know if you're moving towards freedom or not? Like you mentioned earlier, you can have an addiction and you feel free, maybe in the moment. We spoke earlier about perception and feeling, but then like, how do you know, or how do you measure, what kind of criteria can you use to know if you're truly free, or if it's an illusion, maybe?
Also, adding to what you say, I think there's a lot of culture, like cultural interested within this question, because like freedom to me as a Brazilian can be different from freedom to, you know, whatever the person from any other country. So it's, I think that can be added to the question somehow. I don't know.
So is it contextualizing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we are talking about contextual freedom, right? Or contextual ethics. And sometimes it's just simply because it's in a different vein. Like the examples that you all gave earlier, right? There's a kind of captivity in not being able to communicate or read or learn things because I don't know this language. And so I learn the language and I'm freed, right? That's one kind of contextualization of what freedom is. And then the other part of contextualization would have consequences of, well, this is legal here, but it's not illegal here. This causes harm in this situation, but in this situation, it's actually helping the person. So there is some contextualization. I think the question of the criteria, how do we know what freedom is, right, is an important one. And of course, within the context of this conversation and this series of conversations, and a Christian worldview, right, we would take, to a certain extent, we would take this back and say, well, what does Scripture talk about? How do we know from Scripture what is true freedom and valuable for us, and what is more binding for us than what is helpful, right? So we're going to look for principles based on Scripture and based on Christianity that would help us to determine what freedom looks like. And then we have to try and figure out how do we apply those within the context. Feels maybe like a little bit of a cop-out, and yet at the same time, we are trying to live biblical lives. So we go back there as a source.
Yes, and there's so much information in the Bible in so many different ways, written in so many different ways, that we definitely will find quite a lot there. So we'll come back to this in a moment, but let's see also what Andrew wanted to share a bit earlier.
Yeah, speaking about this, it takes me to the Garden of Eden. You know,
Mhm.
the whole point of freedom where God gave Adam, but then I'm seeing also a lot of restriction there again. Like, although there is freedom to choose from any fruit, then there's restriction. But I see sometimes this freedom is actually, this restriction is also a kind of freedom, in a
Mhm.
sense, from sin.
Mhm.
Yes, Adam is free from sin, or free from the consequences of sin if this restriction is given. Like, for example, if there were no rules, you know, if there's no rule of killing or murder or consequences, I would not feel free to go out. It's 12 in the night right now here in Philippines. I would feel scared to go out if there was no such rules. But having those rules by the government, or in moral responsibility, I am free to go out knowing that if someone does something to me, there's consequences.
Mhm.
So there's an element of freedom that I feel with restrictions. I'm trying to understand, which I'm coming to my question is, God's sovereignty. Where does his sovereignty intersect with human freedom? Is
Mhm.
it contradictory, or is it compatible? I mean, any thoughts on this area?
Yeah, and this is that question of the spectrum, like what are we looking at in the middle? Right? If God is, for salvation, for example, predetermining double predestination, who's going to be saved and who's going to be lost, is there any freedom in there at all for humanity? Or has he predestined us in the sense that all are free to come to him for salvation, and he's made provision for everyone to be saved, and then it depends on our choice as to whether we want to be with God or not, right there? And that spectrum of ideas, is it compatible? Is human choice compatible with God's sovereignty, or is it incompatible with God's sovereignty? These are those big questions along that spectrum. And some will say no, and some will say yes. It's absolutely has to be involved. I think one of the passages that I like the most as far as illustrating this is the parable of the wedding feast, right? God, the parable Jesus is telling is the master goes out and tells his servants, go invite everybody to come. First, those who have received invitations. And when they say no, okay, now go into the highways and the hedges and the byways and just invite everybody to come, right? So they're all invited. The house is full. And then there's one individual there who decides not to put on the wedding garment that is provided for him, given for him to come into the party. And the master says, look, if you don't want to be here, if you don't want this wedding garment, then out you go, right? And the end of that parable, the line is, many are called, but few are chosen. Well, according to the parable, who did the choosing? The invitees. Oh, I have something else to do. I'm not going to come. Oh, I got to go take care of my oxen. Oh, I just bought a new plot of land. Or, yeah, I'll show up, but I don't really want to even wear the wedding garment, right? And then they're removed. So there's, in that parable of salvation, all are invited. That's predestined. But the response of those who come and accept the invitation is based on their ability to choose.
So I'm going to try to connect Andrew's question with our previous segment of conversation, because I think they are related. Because in a sense, God's sovereignty, the way he manifests freedom himself, is a model for us. First of all, he created us in his image. But not only that, and of course that image is marred by sin, so we're called back into the image of God, so to speak. But at the same time, we have this gift of freedom given by God to us in the way he created us in human nature, right? And how we use that can be more like God or further away from the divine model. So maybe let's delve a bit more into how God manifests his freedom. What kind of sovereign is God of the universe, right? What is the balance between control and permissiveness? Maybe I can put it this way. How does he use his freedom in that sense?
Yeah. So some of this kind of comes back to the conversation we had the last time I was on this show, episodes, whatever it's called, and that is a power, right? So what kind of sovereign is God, which gets us back into kind of categories of power. What kind of power does he use? And those who have critiqued the classical point of view will say that that is God using coercive power, right? And so then his sovereignty, the coercive power, means that we don't have freedom to choose in the big scheme of things. Whereas somewhere in the middle, they might say God has more of a persuasive power. Like, here's the things that would be good for you. Let me influence or persuade or give you the options to kind of choose here, but I'd really like you to move this way. Some will have called it kind of an alluring kind of power, like, let me lure you towards the choices that I have for you. And then all the way to the other side is this liberative power. And so God's sovereignty, his power, is used to basically just open up all of the options, liberate all the choices for us, to show that to us. And then he doesn't really get involved in all. He's just like, here's all the choices, do what you want to do, right? For a more like down-to-earth and practical example of this, because I teach in a context of healthcare, we talk about this in the sense of like physicians, right? Physicians could come to their patients and say, okay, we run some tests. Here's the things that this is what's going on. This is what needs to happen. This is your plan of care. We're going to do this. Here we go, right? That's kind of a coercive power. Like, I know what's wrong. I know how to fix it. You're going to do what I say, right? On the other end of that, a physician could come in and say, okay, so what do you think is wrong? What do you think is going on with you? Okay, let's run some tests. Here's all the stuff that we've figured out. Here's all the various treatments that could be done. What do you want to do? And then we find somewhere in the middle where the physician says, okay, what's going on with you? How is this affecting your life? Here's the tests we've run. Here's the results we've determined. There is this big list of possibilities of what we could do. From my point of view and from the things that I've learned and am observing, I think probably this or this are probably our best options. What do you think about that? Right. So instead of dictating what's going to happen, or instead of just leaving the patient out there to flounder in all the options, they step into this space of guiding. And I think that that is the kind of space that we often see in Scripture, right? God shows up and says, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham says, okay, but what if there's this many people? Okay, if there's that many people. Well, what if there's this many people? Okay, if there's that many people. And God accompanies Abraham through this process of decision making, right? Through being there, guiding us through. This is the promise of Jesus, walking with people throughout the time he's there. This is the process of the promise of the Holy Spirit. He'll be here to guide us and to remind us of the things that Jesus has taught us. So it's kind of a guiding sovereignty, a guiding freedom.
So as I was listening to the comments, it come to my mind a few things, and I would like to share with you. It seems to me, I have this impression that we use freedom with expectation, either for good or for bad. But let us think on the position of God in the use of freedom. I think he uses freedom without expectation. He already knows the aftermath, the result, the consequence of any choice. So what is the difference, or can you see difference between our use of freedom and how God deals with freedom?
Without getting into specifics and current events of the moment, right, that we see happening around us in governance, we once again we kind of see a spectrum, but we'll see some people who say we need to legislate this particular moral choice, right? And we are therefore going to constrict what can or cannot be done, which is a fairly significant difference from the way God uses freedom. Because God will say, you can do whatever you want. The consequences will come, the consequences will happen, right? And then on the other side, he also gives us boundaries and laws and rules and scripture principles to say, this is the best way for you to live, right? So there is kind of some legislation around moral choices. And there are consequences that come from that. So if we go sometimes people will say, well, we'll just go completely anarchist and let everybody do whatever they want to do and have no structure whatsoever, right? And that's not really in that space of where God is working with freedom either. So it's once again the spectrum and trying to come to this balanced point of view in the center. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
I kind of want to get into the guilty that might comes, or like what the freedom can do towards a guilty person. And I say that because of the example that I give. So how would you say that in the Bible perspective, do you think there's a way of us to learn that through the Bible. And which story would you like give as an example?
Of
Does that make sense?
freedom from guilt.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the example you gave was really nice in the sense that, right, we gain freedom through empathy, through understanding another person's point of view. And actually, when you asked your question at the beginning, like, what have you learned from another culture, right? Like, there's things that I would not understand about freedom, and also wouldn't understand about my possible role in the guilt of restricting freedom from others without learning through empathy from another person, right? Um, biblical story wise, I think about Jesus and the woman who was caught in adultery, right? Thrown in front of him. You're guilty. She should be condemned. She should be stoned. And instead, Jesus puts this back in the lap of the accusers and says, any of you without sin, you go ahead and throw the first stone, right? Where's your empathy in this for this person who's been caught in this compromised situation? And the freedom there of forgiveness, right? If we look at this list of captivity and freedom, bitterness and forgiveness, or condemnation and a state of grace, right? Those things. It's another way of looking at captivity and freedom. And I think that guilt and empathy example is a great example of that kind of comparison.
I was also thinking that how the topic that we're talking can also like relate to the other topics of the podcast, like when it comes to justice. And exactly the example that you give, like we are not the ones to judge. So there's freedom in that because it's not our job. And when it comes to truth, John 8:32, I think it is, you shall know the truth and the truth will set you free, something like that. So I think it's just awesome how everything is just like connected and how there's relief. I think for me, I think trying to define freedom, it would be relief. Like this is something less. I don't know if it's because I'm like at the end of semester and there's a lot of things going on. So I'm just like really tired. So everything that's like related to relief, I'm just like, oh, okay, freedom. So yeah, it's just awesome to see how all of it's kind of connected. So yeah, I just want to point it out.
Yeah. Yeah, it is connected and in interesting ways. Right. And to talk about it kind of from the other side of this too is sometimes justice is done in order to bring freedom. Right. International justice mission was something I learned about a long time ago when I was in youth ministry. And there was a group that was based in DC, and they would go and find those who had been captive, taken captive within sex trade and sex slavery within the United States, and go in as a justice mission to set them free. So it's an interesting balance to walk, right? Like, well, we don't judge people and therefore we have empathy towards them and we extend freedom to them. Yes, 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 we do that. Jesus did that with that woman caught in adultery, with those who are victims. And then at the same time, those who are oppressive, right? Jesus calls them out. Like, you're beating up on the weak. This is not okay. And so at that point, making a judgment call extends freedom to those who are being oppressed.
So would you say that like basically our job would be to help people like to go towards Jesus, or there's something that we as human beings, like sinners and everything that we are, is there something that we can do about that besides helping like people to walk towards Jesus.
Mm. I mean, walking towards Jesus is definitely the place to begin, right? Even whether it's for the victim or whether it's for the oppressor, either one of those roles. Let's come towards Jesus and find out what forgiveness looks like and how that might be transformative for you, right? But there also is some level of social responsibility for us as well to say, to call out suffering, to step in and relieve suffering. There's a theologian, his name is Samuel Wells, and he talks about the different ways that we can engage with people. One, we could work for people. So we could do a lot of stuff for people. And he talks about homelessness, right? Like I could do a lot of work for the homeless. I could make meals, I could bring it to them. Second way is to work with them. Okay, so now we can be on a council. We can work together with those who are homeless to help provide for the things that they need, right? We can be for people, as in we can take up the cause and we can write a blog and we can call out the injustices and we can, we need to call them just people, not homeless, because that's right. We can take up those kind of cause related things. The fourth way he talks about is being with people. And really, that's the core, right? That's the core of everything. And he also compares this to the whole plan of salvation. The whole plan of salvation is for Jesus to be with us. So what can we do to offer freedom? Can we invite them to Jesus? Yeah. By being with them, right? Being with them. That's really the core of it.
That's community in that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm intrigued with the conversation. Like we have kind of moved from a more theological base to a more moral responsibility, that freedom actually empowers us in a sense that we have a moral obligation to connect to and to produce. In light of that, since we are, just speaking about this, we all believe that we all have freedom. That's the basic. What external factors might influence our freedom, or what might be the pitfalls from your perspective that might influence our freedom to choose maybe what is right? Or
yeah. There's so much, right? There's so many external influences we could talk about, whether it's socially or economically or all of these various factors. One of the ones that I'll talk about often in one of my classes is family patterns or genetics. Sometimes we look at it in the sense of genetics, right? We inherit certain genetics, and it seems for a long time, scientists said we are predetermined based on the genetics that we have. And then science comes along later and says, oh, but there's epigenetic changes. There's these things that we can do that will reshape our minds and the way that our neurons connect. And while we might still have tendencies towards this thing, we can make choices to shift who we are different than the family patterns before us, right? Which then in scripture and in biblical language, we would say the sin is passed on to the third and the fourth generation, meaning the patterns of behavior, right? Abraham lied about being married to his wife to Pharaoh. Isaac lied about being married to his wife to Pharaoh. Sibling rivalry passed through the generations, right? We can read those stories. We can see those family patterns. So that would be one external example. And yet, even within that, we have the ability to, and this comes back to the previous conversation about power, we have the individual power to also make choices within those external influences, to find relief, to find freedom. Sometimes it's only mental, right? Sometimes we can't free ourselves from the slave master, for example. So how do we find freedom with that kind of external influence. And it turns to this mindset, it turns to this, I do have freedom in Jesus and who I am, even though I am oppressed by an external force that's beyond my control.
Yeah, I think going back to the example of addiction that I gave, because that really stayed with me. You know, how somebody can really in that moment believe that they are exercising freedom, they're experiencing freedom. And then the consequences later can be so detrimental, especially long term. And I wonder if we can connect a bit here, freedom. We've talked about power, we talked a bit about justice, but what about love? Because ultimately, you can have all these, you can have freedom, power, and other gifts, so to speak. But if you're not using them with love, with loving intention and motive, then they become vices instead of virtues, right? And so with God's sovereignty, that's what we see in the way, even the way you explained it, that it's neither too controlling, but it's neither completely unrestricted, because he knows, he created us, so he knows what we need. So he sets boundaries that are best for our functioning, for our best functioning, out of love. And his motive is always love. And so if we could try to emulate that in the way we love not just others, but also ourselves. That's why I go back to the example of addiction. Is that a loving thing to do for you, given all the scientific data and the knowledge about where it leads in the end? Now, I know that's very complicated, so I'm not really guilt tripping people here for that particular issue, because there's always issues behind it, of course. But still, the question remains: how can we connect love and freedom so that freedom is a virtue?
Yeah, if power and freedom and justice aren't held within the boundaries of love, right, they can go wrong in so many different directions. And the addiction is such an interesting thing, as you mentioned, because it is so complicated, right? Talking to the addict, are the things that you are choosing to do with your addiction, are they loving towards yourself? Are they loving towards others around you? Right? I talk about salvation and suffering being very tied together, and justification relieving the suffering of guilt and shame, and sanctification relieving the suffering that we cause ourselves and those directly around us. And then there's suffering that we can't control, which we wait for glorification for the relief from that suffering, right? And so love within that sanctification area, it's a conversation of love to the addict about what are you going to do with this? What are the choices you're going to make? And then it's also a conversation of love towards those who are being affected by the addict, or seeing the addict, especially if they're not experiencing empathy, right? Like, what is the narrative? How did they get there? And so we have to approach them with love and understanding regarding that too. Maybe they are stuck. Maybe genetically they're stuck. Maybe they're captive because of the life circumstances they've gone to, and addiction is the only way they've had to cope with that. So even that engagement of their freedom and making better choices needs to be held within the context of love, right?
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to maybe just expand a bit here for a second. I used to have a very narrow concept of addiction, because I don't know, I guess the concept just is broadened over time with literature, but addiction can take so many forms. And I think in some way, all of us at some point or another in life, we react at the surface, so to speak. Our issues react at the surface in some form of addiction, including work addiction, including, like, you probably know much better about this, Cory, where you work. So it's in some way, I almost feel like the word addiction in this episode kind of captures the precisely the oppressive nature of misuse of freedom.
Mm.
In any way that addiction gets manifested. I don't know why, but somehow they're really connected in my mind right now in this conversation.
Yeah, I think it matches up a lot, especially with what you mentioned before, right? Like if our choices can lead us towards greater freedom, or our choices can lead us towards more captivity.
Mm-hmm.
And addiction is a very clear paradigm of that kind of thing happening. And whatever context that is, codependency can be an addiction, right? And you can totally mess up the relationships in your life based on the choices you make to be more free, to have relationships, or to find abandonment and rejection based on those kinds of choices. So it makes sense. I think the two definitely come together.
As we were listening, I heard a few concept words that came to my mind and brought me some questions. For example, the connection between freedom of choice and personality. I know that most of our personality is it's a collection or a combination of all the choices we make during life. I know that some of the choices we have, or some of the situations, we have control, we can choose freely and fine. But other situations, we have no control nor choice. I think that freedom relates directly to personality. So all that we do, all that we choose makes what we are. So I also see that freedom of choice brings us. It's like an opportunity. It's something that we have all day long, and we can develop or even design what we will do with the situations that we don't have control about. And so I see that this is the step of faith as well. For example, what I see as well is that the basis or the fundamental thing that should be the core of freedom, which was morals, these days have been it's being replaced by rights. What people think the right is. So it's like they take away morals and set the basis for freedom of what human have as understanding. So it's like we switch what God established, and he knows everything. So he knows the consequences, the aftermath of everything. And we take him away and we place humans in the place so that we set what not knowing humans have in mind as to be the basis of freedom. So I see how dangerous and how good it can be. But I also see this connection between freedom and personality. How do you see that?
Yeah. So personality, or some would say character, right? But personality, one, does come from the choices that we make. Often they're choices that we are making in response to our surroundings, right? So we might think of them, especially early on, depending on what's happening in our family, our personality might be developed as coping mechanisms to be able to survive the things that we're experiencing that are painful, right? Or they might be ways to express and enjoy the things that are good, right? So personality, our freedom and our personality are connected with those moral choices that we are making. And yet our personality is also a way of coping with the difficult external influences in our lives. And so at some point, and this is where, like you said, we get into these kind of rights things, right? So based on my personality, which means the narrative and the way that I've coped with my narrative, I would say I have this right and you have this right and you have this right, based on my narrative, my experience, my personality. Whereas somebody from a different personality, different narrative, different personality, would come and say, oh, well, these are the rights that we need. These are the things that each person needs and must value. And so it can become very subjective, right? So then we come back to that kind of question that Adelena asked earlier. Well, what criteria then do we use? And you mentioned it too. Oh, well, maybe it's the morals, maybe it's the principles, maybe it's moral principles coming from scripture that can help deal with all this variety of personality and find loving context of boundaries by which we can give people freedom and exercise our own freedom to continue to encourage freedom for all in a loving, healthy direction, right? Rather than the chaotic, harmful direction that freedom could take us if we decide to go a different direction.
Yeah, I think we're coming to the end of the conversation due to time, unfortunately, but we've had many points, many connecting dots here that we probably will wrestle with beyond this hour that we spent together, which is helpful because at the end of the day, we want answers that open up more questions that give us time and opportunities to reflect. And that's also an opportunity, I think, for God to come into our own circumstances and speak to us in our own context, to grapple with things. Because as Raphael mentioned when you were speaking, I was thinking, yeah, that's what makes us unique, that combination of external and internal factors, and that's how God wants us to be unique. So we have to find our own freedom, so to speak, but based on principles derived from God as well. One last comment from me, coming back to this idea of God as sovereign and as an example for us, right? I think what I really like about being able to look at God is that God is a Trinity. And to put it very simply, yes, we talked about love, but to put it very simply for me, what I see in the Trinity in the Bible is that God always, like one person of the Godhead always lifts the other up.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what I understand to be the greatest manifestation of confident freedom, where you do not need to tear somebody else down so that you feel valuable. You just always shed value to the upon the other, and that's how everybody's happy, basically. I mean, that's the divine model, right? And I think that can be applied in so many contexts. It's always difficult, of course, when people are not treating you well and you're not inclined to respond positively, because why would you? The tendency is, I think, to be fair as opposed to merciful. But God is also merciful as well as just. And so I lean towards, personally, the way, I guess, where I'm in life right now, I think that's probably one good lesson for me in terms of how to use freedom. So I'll stop speaking so that we have all a chance to to share some takeaways, and then we'll come back to you, Cory, for some concluding remarks. So takeaways.
Something I will bring with me from this conversation is about the fact that God has self-limited himself. It's interesting that this affirmation. It's like God is if we can say someone is free in the universe, is God. We know that, but he chooses to restrict himself. His self limits his own actions. So I think this is this is the way how he shows us that even freedom has to be used wisely.
For me, I kind of took that freedom is love, and I mean in the sense of when you when you understand freedom as love, you don't want to, like, I'm gonna get the example of oppressed uh in the victim. When you are the victim, you want freedom, right? So the thing is, what I'm gonna do with this freedom, I'm gonna be like an oppressor to another person, I'm gonna do the same thing that people were doing to me, or am I just gonna, help others to get out of that situation? So my concept of freedom completely changed today. So I'm kind of seeing more in a lovable way. So this idea of I'm not alone. I got the freedom. I'm not alone. I'm gonna help other people to get this. I'm not gonna oppress others to see like, see, this is what we were doing to me. But quite the opposite. I'm gonna help them find freedom through love, through empathy. So yeah, I'm taking that.
I like the point that Cory said in the beginning is a quotation from an author about holiness. That was just set the tone for the whole talk. It's still stuck in my mind about how when you experience that holiness, that wonder, it just uplifts you into experiencing true freedom with Christ. And that relates with, it's relational as well with each other, our families and community, because in the end, freedom is not an abstract idea, but it is a relational idea. And I feel that's something that I will be taking away.
I think I'm just gonna share a kind of a new idea, maybe. I don't know if it's so much a summary of the conversation, but it arose in my mind as you guys were sharing yours. And I wonder, Cory, if you can speak to it a bit more in your concluding remarks, if it makes sense to you, because it's about presence and absence. And since you're the presence expert here, because like the very fact that God restrains himself, right, or restricts himself, that's a healthy form of absence, maybe I could say, right? So freedom, especially in relations to others, can be manifested in a healthy balance of presence and absence. How nearness and closeness, distance, sorry, and closeness. How to find the right balance, I don't know if we can really say, because it depends on any two people that interact. Because it's never going to be the same with just anybody. But is there anything that you could share on presence and absence in relation to freedom? I'm just curious.
Yeah. It's a really interesting question. I think that if we go back to kind of these big, the spectrum idea again of the various views of theology and the various views of presence, right? The view that God is outside and removed from us time and space wise would say the only way that presence can happen is through these sacramental moments into our kind of within our soul, right? There's a little part of us that's timeless too. And so somehow there's a connection there. But the freedom that's there is a very God prescribed, God directed. There is no real freedom for us to choose within that space. And it's interesting because when you go to the other side, the way that process theologians particularly view presence is in a panentheistic kind of way. So everything is included within the presence of God. Everything is included within the being of God. And that complete liberation, freedom, where God's not actually, he's just absorbing all of the choices. And all of the freedom choices are just a part of who God is, right? Whereas the balance of this is a God who is present, who keeps showing up in time and space and in interactions, and recognizes God is a unique person. We are unique people. And there is an exchange of ideas, of love, of direction, of all the things that go back and forth between individuals and God, between the world and God. And so it's this self-limited, interactive, interpersonal nature of presence, and then therefore of freedom. We come back to that kind of guiding metaphor. And the other thing that comes to mind as you were mentioning the comments on the Trinity, for kind of as a closing remark, which fits well with this, is that this communicates value. The Trinity is communicating value to each other, right? They're lifting one another up, serving one another. But God, self-limiting and being present in an interpersonal kind of way, also communicates a value of us. God so loved the world. There's value communicated there, that he sent his only son to directly interact with us. It's not looking at us as worms, as, you know, those lost. So depravity doesn't negate value. We may be sinful and we may need a savior for sure, but this doesn't mean that we aren't seen as valuable. We're called the children of God before salvation happens. Jesus died for us while we are yet sinners, and yet there's a recognition, a growing in that relationship with God, that until glorification happens, children of God are yet to be revealed. So there's value communicated in that kind of presence and that kind of interpersonal freedom, that we are all loved and we all have value. And so we can then communicate that to others as we extend choice, limiting on ourselves and saying, you have value and I'm here to be present with you.
A heartfelt thank you to our special guests and to the student panelists for their thoughtful engagement. On behalf of our sponsor, the Adventist Theological Society, and on behalf of the Life with God team, I would like to also thank our viewers and our listeners for being here. We hope that you have learned some new and helpful insights that will transform you more into the likeness of God and empower you to become a better human being. As you can see, these conversations bring together young adults and scholars who have dedicated their lives to advancing our understanding of God, of the Bible, and of the complex human personhood. It is a unique opportunity for you to get to know these committed servant leaders and learn from them as they interact with students from around the world. If you would like to support this podcast, you can do so with your presence, your comments, your prayers, and by sharing the program. If you're so inclined, you can also extend your financial support by donating to the Adventist Theological Society. To do so, go to www.atsjats.org/resources and find the Donate Now button. Make sure you also subscribe to the Adventist Theological Society YouTube channel, where you will find past and ongoing seasons. Thank you again, and I hope that you will join us next time as well.